so much. I really have to thank Eileen for such a great introduction, and Rachel in the center. Like I was saying the last time I was in this room, I was sitting in the audience, and so it's slightly strange being up here presenting, but very exciting. So today I'm going to talk about my book that came out in the last year called Suicide Protests in South Asia. And I want to begin with two very quick stories. In 1990, a number of high caste students throughout North India and part of South India, in protest of the government's decision to implement the Mundell Commission report to increase reserve spaces for low caste students in public sector jobs, began to self-immolate and use other forms of suicide in protest of this government policy. The students, approximately 67 of which died, and there are some numbers that suggest at least 200 attempted to use suicide, were never able to stop the implementation of the act. Other effects happened, but the act itself actually was executed, and in fact continues to be a point of contention to this day. Cut to 2011, and we have Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, a single protester or a single person actually, who self-immolates for a variety of different reasons people have talked about, but self-immolates and incites the large-scale democratic shift in Tunisia, and in fact the president of Tunisia at that time was deposed in part because of Bouazizi's self-immolation act. So the question that really underlines my book and the talk today is this: why does suicide protest work in some cases and not in others? And so I don't discuss or I don't engage with why do groups utilize this. I can talk about that in question and answers. I've written articles about that. But the book really focuses on this puzzle. Why is it that at some points suicide protest seems to have a lot of power and resonance, can actually create policy change, whereas in others it just fizzles away and really doesn't do much of anything. And there are a couple of takeaways that conclusions I've drawn from my study that we'll hopefully get to by the end of the talk. Okay, so there are a couple of different reasons that scholars have attributed to why movements succeed and fail. Underlying all of this, of course, is that the definition of success and failure in social movements is incredibly contested. There are a lot of different ways we can measure or track when a movement is successful or when it isn't. And I'll talk about the measure that I used in a second. But just to really quickly go over this, some scholars of social movements, especially those who are focused on Western movements in the 60s and 70s, really focus on the ability of movements to disrupt everyday life as a key component for when a social movement can actually get something from the state. So the use of violence is seen as one of those additive or special things that a movement can do that other kinds of political institutions can't. Later on, we have Marco Giuni, and he's looking at movements in Europe, and he suggests that it's really the ability of movements to sway public opinion that can act as a pressure valve on governments, and that's what will really help movements to get some kind of positive policy outcome. And he's really focusing again on democratic states. If we look at the literature on political violence, which I also draw from, we have some scholars who will say that violence is more effective in weak states, whereas others are saying that violence can actually create a lot of negative opinions in states and will actually be less successful or less efficacious in trying to get some type of reaction from the state. And then just really quickly looking at suicide bombing, which is really the only kind of literature that looks at this kind of phenomenon, though suicide bombing is different than suicide protest. Robert Page says that suicide bombing can be effective in democratic states. When we look at success and failure, again, as I said, there are a lot of different kinds of definitions. So in order to be as clear as possible, measure success simply as, does the movement get what they want, their stated goal? I fully think that there are a lot of different ways we can talk about success and failure. And in fact, when I shift to focus on some other movements, I actually look at that different kinds of success. But in the bulk of the book, I really am focusing on, the movement has a stated goal. Does the movement get the goal that they want? So my book is focused on this approach that I call the tactical approach, because I'm really trying to understand the effect of a particular tactic, not the mobilization as a whole. And so the tactical approach focuses on 4 critical factors that I think can really help or hurt a movement in their deployment of this particular act of suicide protest. So first, what I do is I look at what I call tactical depth. So basically what I'm saying is that if a movement is going to use some kind of extreme action, violence or suicide protest, then it is important for the movement to also use a constellation of other kinds of protest tactics, especially nonviolent tactics or regular, normal, habitual forms of protest. So if a movement has a high level of tactical depth, meaning they use a lot of different kinds of tactics, it is more likely that movements will, the suicide protest will be successful. I also measure whether or not the suicide protest results in death. As you'll find, as I'll discuss later, there have been many, many times when the suicide protest actually doesn't end in death, especially when it's the type of protest is a hunger strike. Those can end a lot more quickly before death happens. And so this becomes an incredibly important aspect of the protest tactic. I also track whether or not the movements narrate their use of these tactics. I call these emotional narratives. Any kind of political action will be judged on a lot of different factors. And so something like suicide protest, which can be confusing and often happens very quickly, movements have to be able to engage and talk about these tactics with the public and the state. I'm not measuring whether or not people actually feel pride or sympathy and shame. That's impossible. But I'm actually just looking at whether or not the movements how do they talk about these acts after they've happened? How do they talk about the actor? Do they talk about who they were, their biographies? Do they try to create this sense of familiarity? And if they do, then it's much more likely that suicide protests will be successful. And then finally, I look at the level of political competition, and by that I really mean, the number of different political actors who can, in the terms of political science, be veto players for the state. So in what ways can these different political actors help or hurt the movement, and can the movement actually harness these different political actors and these different sort of factions within the state? So when I think about, or when I conceptualize this approach, the way I like to think about it, it's not that any one tactic is necessarily more important than the other, and I turn to music to think about it. I think about it like a string quartet. At times, the cello will take precedence, but all of the other 3 instruments are still really important, and at other times it'll be the violin. Depending on the stage at which the tactic is being deployed, all of these things are going to be working together, and they're all necessary, and at times one might take control, but really they work in conjunction with one another. Okay, so what are definitions of suicide protest? I keep talking about it, but I haven't actually talked about what it is. Suicide protest events, the study of suicide protest generally is a relatively burgeoning field. There aren't that many of us who do it, but those of us who do keep talking to each other and arguing about what we think should be included. Work that's been done on this previously has really focused on, on a particular instance of fasting to death, or a particular self-immolation or group of self-immolations. And so most of the previous or historical work that's been done on these kinds of tactics, by this I mean fasting to the death, self-immolation, people in India have hung themselves or drank poison, and there are lots of other kinds of suicide protests. For the most part, people have just focused on these things individually and not looked at them as, again, a constellation of tactics that fit together. There are some narrow definitions of suicide protest. So Michael Biggs, he really only focuses on what he calls self-immolations. He thinks that fasting to the death should not be included because it's qualitatively different, whereas others like Amrita Basu really take a broader understanding of suicide protest. So for my book, and I sort of generally think that this is true, I define suicide protest as suicide used by a movement with the intent to create a political outcome. My work is really embedded in the social movement literature, which I guess I learned here. And so this is really trying to, it is putting as much emphasis on the protest as it is on the suicide. It really is about trying to create political change and also embedded within an organization. And in a lot of ways, what I think this definition does is that it takes away acts that are not necessarily intended for change. So I talk about those later in the book. So one phenomenon that happens in India quite a bit is that a lot of times it will be reported that somebody, went in front of a municipal building, said some words, and set themselves on fire. In a lot of ways, that's clearly a political act. They're doing it in public, but it's not embedded within a larger organization. They're not trying to get something that has been a sustained kind of claim for a very long time. So I tend to exclude those kinds of protests. I think that they're still important, but not necessarily for the type of story that I'm trying to tell. Okay, so how did I do this work? I did field work in India and Sri Lanka in 2005, 6, and 2010. I did, for the most part, qualitative field research. I did interviews when possible. I did a lot of archival research and looked at government documents. I collected as much movement literature as possible. I looked at all of the different media accounts for all of the different acts that I was looking at, as well as non-participant observation. I really think that in order to understand this phenomenon, and really a lot of different phenomena out there, you have to go to the site and really try to dig deep and see what's actually happening, especially because not too many people had studied this before. And it was just really important to understand how groups could create the space where this kind of decision could take place. Okay, so I do a comparative case analysis. I did some fancy footwork here. My 3 cases in India are the 1952 fast to the death by Pati Sriramulu for the state of Andhra, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and I focused particularly on their use of fasting to the death in the late 1980s and mid-90s, and then the anti-reservation movement, which I talked about in the start of the talk in 1990. I then stretched my theory to see whether or not it can apply to the use of suicide bombing by the Tamil Tigers from 1983 to 2009. And then I actually go further, and using secondary sources, I try to sort of push the boundaries of my research design even farther, and I look at the case of the fast in the maze in Northern Ireland in 1981, the movement for Tibet in China, the series of self-immolations that are ongoing actually, and one just happened a few days ago, and I got the ping in my email notification of it. Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation in Tunisia, and then Malachi Richter's self-immolation in Chicago in 2006, which I'm going to guess not many people knew about.
I actually knew him personally.
Oh, I would love to talk to you.
I don't know him very well, but he was a pianist, and I managed a music store, and he's my boss's best friend.
Yeah, the only people who wrote about him were music journalists, actually. Yeah, I was living in Madison when he self-immolated, writing about self-immolation, and it took me a while to find out about it. And Eiley told me about it, and I was like, I feel like I should have. We didn't have email alerts for self-immolation back then in 2006, I guess, or we had email but no alerts. So yes, I talk about him a little bit as well. But for today, I'm really going to focus on the 3 cases in India. but I'm happy to talk about any of the other cases later on. Okay, Patisaramalu. This is Patisaramalu. In 1947, India gets independence, and one of the sort of most crucial questions facing the government was, what were the internal borders going to look like? There had been an ongoing movement for a couple of different linguistic-based states. Just to really quickly do this map. Up until this point, the British had created these large sort of administrative units called presidencies, and so the Telugu-speaking population was sort of incorporated into the larger Madras presidency, and their movement had really existed well before independence, but in a lot of ways the Telugu movement had sort of set aside their own particularistic goals in order to try to get independence from the British, with the understanding that once independence would happen, that their claims would be taken seriously. By 1951, that was really not the case. Nehru seemed very ill-disposed to creating linguistic states. And so the movement started to intensify after independence. Patisaramalu goes on a fast to the death in October in Madras, and he dies after 56 days in December of that year. After his death, there were a number of riots, and then 3 days later, Nehru says, I think that we should have a state of Andhra for Telugu speakers. It has nothing to do with this person who just fasted to the death. I just think it's time. So, he's trying to say it has nothing to do with Patisaramalu, though I think clearly we can think that that's the case. So in looking at this, Patisaramalu was actually the only person to have died from a fast to the death in post-independence India. In looking at this case, in terms of I had another map. This is what they wanted, and this is what they ended up getting before India takes over Hyderabad, and then it becomes Andhra Pradesh. And of course, now we know that Andhra Pradesh has the new state of Telangana out of it as well. In looking at the Andhra movement and Patisaramalu's fast to the death, we can see that this is really one of the only cases of long-term successful agitation and policy change, with the use of suicide protests as a central component of the mobilization. The movement for Andhra had very, very high tactical depth. As I said, it was a really very long-term, sustained mobilization action. They used court appeals, legislative contestation, a lot of different kinds of mass mobilization, and as well as some limited violence. But it was really marked for the fact that it utilized a lot of different kinds of tactics, and had people, that were elected officials as well as civil servants. A lot of different people were involved with the movement. Clearly, it was high intensity. Saramalu died. And the movement had a great opportunity to try to deploy these emotional narratives. So one of the things that I talk about is the need to create sort of pride and sympathy between the constituents, the possible supporters of the movement, and the actor. And one way you do that is to create a sense of familiarity and knowing between the actor and this larger population. And so over the course of his fast, his condition was talked about in the newspapers every day. His history as a Gandhian was talked about. It was really, if you, going back and looking at the newspaper accounts, it was really an attempt to sort of not only get the population to know this particular actor and his history, but also the kinds of things his body was going through during the course of the fast to the death. For those of you who don't know, and you probably shouldn't, starving to death is a very, very, very hard way to die. It's very rough on the body and really painful. And so you can see as time goes on, this sort of, almost a death watch, though hopefully not one, that really tries to create this bond. I couldn't measure whether or not the bond was actually created, but certainly it seemed like the movement, was trying to make sure that everyone knew what was happening. And of course, they were trying to direct this sort of emotional narrative of shame towards the government. And there were like Telugu speakers and Telugu MPs in Parliament, talking about his fast. And this was really speeded or helped along by the fact that Nehru basically refused to acknowledge it. I think he wrote a letter to the governor of Madras at that time saying something along the lines of, I think something's going on in your part of India. I really have chosen to ignore it completely. And so you could really sense this idea that they're railing and trying to get people to notice what's happening, and everyone's talking about it, but the government seems to be relatively silent. Finally, in this time period in India, it was a single-party dominant system. The Indian Congress was really the only game in town, but the Congress Party was incredibly diverse and factionalized internally, and so the movement was really able to capture and play these factions against one another. And so, in that way, it was a relatively politically competitive political time period. So Andhra. The movement for Andhra really sort of showcases and illustrates all of the different factors that I think are important, and was, again, the only long-term success available. Okay, almost close. Okay, well, all right, I'm going to hurry it along. I'm sorry, I'm used to talking a lot longer. The Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is focused, or was focused, on the large hydroelectric dam project that was meant to cover the fifth largest river in India, the Narmada River, really began in the mid-1980s. And I focused particularly on the use of two instances of fasting to the death in the early 90s. And I'll just talk about one because I don't have that much time, so I will just talk about one of them. An environmentalist movement that was at that time period really focused on trying to either substantively change or stop the project, and barring that, get free and fair resettlement and rehabilitation packages for project-affected persons, or PAPs. Led by Medha Patkar, the movement decided to go on a fast to the death, and they've also used other kinds of suicide protests, such as deliberate drowning or waiting for the waters to sort of take them over. And so I'll just focus on one fast in the 1990s. This fast, they decided to go on a fast to the death on the border of the state of, on the border of Gujarat. And they go on a fast to try to get a second environmental and human impact review of the project as a whole. And they were able to get that second review. They were not able to stop the project as a whole, but they were able to get that review. So I'll talk a little bit about what happened during this particular fast. So they do a large demonstration, stop on the border of Gujarat. A few people go on this fast to the death, but they don't die. Before they can die, the World Bank, who was one of the funding agencies for the project, says that, okay, you're right, we need to do another review, we need to figure out what's going on. And if anyone knows anything about the World Bank in the early 90s, the fact that they said that they were going to stop a large-scale state project is somewhat astounding. And they're able to get that project review, and in fact, the World Bank subsequently pulls out of the project as a whole. The project ends up going forward because the state of Gujarat is not going to let it die. So what happened during this fast? The Narmada movement has used a lot of different, it had very high tactical depth, but no one died. In fact, no one's ever died. I was able to speak with some members of the NBA, and they were clearly very committed to their use of fasting to the death. It was democratically decided upon, but one of the quirks of fasting was that it is a long-term tactic, and it allowed for room for negotiation in a way that other kinds of tactics might not. And so they really were able to end the fast before they die. The NBA also used a lot of emotional narratives, but in sort of tracking their own rhetoric, especially around the fast at that time period, what was noticeable was that they didn't talk about the fast in particular. They talked more about the larger social justice concerns of the project and the movement as a whole. And I think that this meant that it doesn't create that kind of bond between the faster and the larger community. And again, the movement had it was acting within a very highly politically competitive time period, though there was a problem of the interstate politics. So the state of Gujarat, MP, Maharashtra would all be affected by this project, and Gujarat was not going to let the project die. They were very heavily invested in the project as one of the key components to their economic success. And so again, they stepped in when the World Bank and the Japanese government actually pull out. So the MBA was able to get short-term goals, short-term successes. They got a second review, they got certain funding agencies to pull out, but ultimately they were not able to stop the project or even really get good rehabilitation packages for the project affected persons. All right, I am going to just speed on through. And then the final case that I want to talk about today is the case I opened the talk with, which is the 1990 students who were fighting the decision, the Mundell Commission report. This is Rajiv Goswami. In 1990, he was the first student to use self-immolation. He actually survived. There were people sort of there, his friends, to kind of douse the flames, and was actually elected to government afterwards. And then he died about a decade or so, 15 years later. The students at this point, so it was actually very difficult for me to get any information about this particular protest because this is a picture of the students, sorry. This is a picture of one of the protests, but actually when I was going to do research in 2006, the government had just decided to increase reservations again in public universities, and this is a more recent protest by medical students in Delhi who are protesting against increasing the number of reservations. So it was hard for me to get information, but it did prove to me that this was still incredibly salient in India, but also that the students really had not been able to end, reservations or to create that narrative of trying to stop the policy to the point where, the policy was going to be reinitiated or increased in a way. So despite the complete, drama and really the trauma of, over 200 cases of suicide protest, young people, you guys, grad students and undergrads doing this throughout northern India, the students were not able to end the policy. And so in trying to understand why, there are a couple of things that start to be clear. The students had very low levels of tactical depth. The only other kinds of protests that were really making any kind of impact were riots and other types of violent movements. Cities were being closed down at that time period, and it was just not, they were not known for doing other kinds of protests, especially nonviolent protests. Certainly they had high levels of intensity, but in a way I think it was almost too high. I don't know, I guess not many of you get notifications of somebody if there's a suicide bombing or a self-immolation like I do, but certainly if you hear about, or if you're living in Madison and there's a protest every day, maybe more than one, at times you can get a numbing effect as these things happen over and over and over again. It's hard to keep track. It's hard to kind of identify with a single actor or even two actors, let alone 200 actors. And so too much intensity can be too much of a good thing or not a good thing at all. They really did not attempt to create an emotional narrative, or they attempted to, they were not very successful at it. And part of that was because they were really co-opted by party politics at that time period. A left front government was in power at that time, and opposition parties were really invested in trying to bring the government down. And so what you found was that other political parties co-opted the movement and utilized the movement for their own political agendas. And that's also why the movement was not really able to take advantage of the political competition that it existed at that time period. So in a lot of ways, what we see is that the anti-reservation movement was just not able to harness the power, I guess, of these kinds of tactics. And it really showcases the fact that even if the tactics are very dramatic, they are not often successful, or they can't be efficacious unless they're actually planned and strategically deployed. So what are some of the conclusions? So what are some of the takeaways from this talk and the book as a whole? Suicide protest, and I really think that this can be extended to a lot of different kinds of violent protest tactics or violent actions, are unlikely to result in political outcomes unless they're used in conjunction with nonviolent actions. If you think about this logically, this makes sense. States, if you're trying to get a state to change their mind or change a policy, they're unlikely to want to negotiate with a group that has only utilized violence or only uses extreme tactics. They want to know that there's a negotiating partner available for them. And that's why you'll find in a lot of terrorist organizations or other kind of movements, you'll have this sort of somewhat artificial dividing line between the violent group and then the political group. They're definitely together, but they even the groups understand that they have to have some kind of partner for the government to talk to. So you have IRA and Sinn Féin, or PLO and Al-Fatah, right? You have this knowledge that, again, states are not going to want to talk to the kids that just keep killing themselves. They're going to want to talk to people who prove that they can harness a lot of people, they have a lot of people listening to them, that they can negotiate in good faith. And so I think that this is something that really can be extended to be relevant for a lot of different kinds of protest and violent action, but certainly is an important factor for suicide protest. High numbers of extreme protest tactics can create this sense of numbing, as I talked about. It can be overwhelming to have this happen every day, to study it or to see it happening all the time. And so groups have to be really careful about how they deploy these kinds of tactics. They have to make sure that they do the third takeaway, which is narrate their use of suicide protest in a way that will signal to their constituents and to the state. So suicide protest is somewhat confusing. People don't understand it. The question I would always get when I was initially doing the research, other than why are you studying that, is, well, they must be crazy. What do you have to say about them? They're just crazy people who do these things. And I mean, first of all, they're not crazy. They're doing these things for reasons. But it's very easy to import your own, understanding of the world on these kinds of tactics. And so groups really have to carefully try to create these bonds and talk about why they're using the tactic. Set out the terms of the debate. The state refuses to listen to us. Why? They're forcing us to do these kinds of things. If you just sort of let these tactics speak for themselves, then you end up with a much more confusing situation where the public can just, deny any type of power to these tactics. And then finally, movements have to try and use the political context to their advantage. The tactic on its own is not enough. They are also political institutions or civil society institutions that are, again, they're trying to get something from the state. And they have to look at the state as a whole, not just their use of the tactic. So how am I? Okay. All right, okay, well, I have, so that's the end of this talk. I can talk about the tigers or anything else if you like, but I guess that's it. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I got Bellevue, so I just wanted to quickly ask, and I've talked to you about this